Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper, and we start with breaking news. Wall Street is about to close any minute now. The Dow collapsing around 1,900 points today. Its worst single-day loss ever, as an oil price war adds to fears over the coronavirus. The Treasury bond today, the yield hit an all-time low. The Treasury bond yield is the government's interest rate to borrow money, and to reiterate, the 30-year U.S. Treasury yield fell below 1% for the first time in American history. Also, the oil market had its worst day in almost 3 decades, and just minutes after opening, the S&P 500 plunged so far it tripped the so-called circuit breaker, triggering a brief pause in trading. CNN's Allison Kozik is at the New York Stock Exchange now. Allison, Wall Street's been on this 11-year rise. Are we officially starting to see the end of the bull market here?
Jake, ironically, today is the 11th anniversary of the bull market, but we are getting close to the end of that bull market based on where stocks are now, about 2% away from a bear market, which would be a 20% drop from a recent high. That's as we close out an historic day here on Wall Street. Much of what you mentioned, those circuit breakers being activated after stocks fell too far and too fast in the morning, putting investors on the sidelines waiting 15 minutes to begin trading again, where we saw oil prices plunge the most since 1991. That's when the Gulf War was in full force, and that's as Saudi Arabia floods the market with oil despite waning demand. And where we saw another red warning sign flash in the bond market, we're seeing yields at record lows. That's because investors are expecting a potential global recession because of the coronavirus. So we've got all of this piling on as those worries and those fears and no one really knows what's going to happen with the coronavirus as far as economies and businesses go. All of that fear weighing on Wall Street, Jake.
All right, Allison Kozik, a very, very bad day on Wall Street. Let's bring in Austin Goolsbee. He's the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. Also with me is CNN Global economic analyst Rana Foroohar. Austin, let me start with you. You tweeted that the markets are more scared now of coronavirus and the oil price war than the days before the 2008 financial crisis. Are things about to get even worse?
Look, I hope not. I tweeted that out when the yield on treasuries went to the lowest ever. And as you said, even at the height of the financial crisis, there wasn't as much of a flight to safety as we saw there. I think we got to grasp the reality that this virus is going to play havoc on the economic growth, and especially in rich countries like the United States, Italy, and others, where so much of the economy is dominated by these face-to-face services, which are exactly the things that get pulled down when people get afraid.
And Rana, you wrote today in the Financial Times, quote, "Watching the markets these days is like watching the 7 stages of grief. Shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and finally acceptance. We clearly have not reached that last stage yet." So are you suggesting there you see a larger economic downturn on the way?
I do. I think that there's a very good chance that we're headed into a U.S. and global recession. I mean, we have the perfect storm here because the markets were ready to correct anyway. Look, I've been saying that for months on your show. If it wasn't the coronavirus, it was going to be something else because, frankly, we have an enormous corporate debt bubble out there that was ready to burst. But we now have this decline in travel and tourism. That's responsible for about 10% of the global economy. It touches 1 in every 8 jobs in the U.S. in some form or another. Add to that the oil prices now, plummeting oil prices. You would think that might have an upside for consumers, but actually what it's going to do is put pressure on some of those debt-ridden companies. You might see those dominoes start to fall, put more pressure on the markets. All of this is affecting people's 401ks. And, the truth is that we have become really addicted in America to asset bubbles to fuel growth. That's something I think President Trump has contributed to. And I don't think it's over yet. I think that unless we saw some kind of major fiscal stimulus, at some point, I think that we're in for a sustained correction and a recession.
I hope you're wrong, of course, as I'm sure you do as well. Austin, oil prices suffered the biggest drop in nearly 30 years. The president tweeted about the oil crash saying, quote, "Good for the consumer, gasoline prices coming down," unquote. I guess that's a silver lining way of looking at it. Low oil prices might be good for consumers in the short term, but potentially, obviously, much more problematic.
Yeah, well, much more problematic because the price of oil is going down precisely because demand is drying up and the economies are all slowing. So the recession, financial crisis and recession of 2007, 8, 9, oil prices plunged. That wasn't good for the economy. It was a sign that the economy was weak. I think there is one glimmer of optimism for a virus business cycle, let's call it, rather than a normal business cycle, which is, let's say the coronavirus behaves like the flu virus, and it is of a season, and then by the summer, the infection rates go way down. There is the possibility that this thing comes roaring back in a way that is not normal for a business cycle that's driven by other things.
And Ronna, let's talk about the travel and tourism industry, because it's been hit hard by coronavirus fears. Airports, train stations in some spots of the world. We're showing some images now from northern Italy. They're virtually empty, ghost towns. You see this as one of the heavier dominoes leading to a possible recession.
Yeah, if you look at what's driven the global economy over the last several years, travel and tourism has been a huge part of it, and in particular Chinese travel and tourism, which of course has completely dried up. But this is one of the things that has really been a big part of the global growth story. So to have that hit and to affect consumption in such a profound way, I mean, think about it. Nobody's going to be traveling, in early summer vacations, or many fewer people. That's going to continue to put pressure on the oil market, on the energy market. It all snowballs together. What worries me, and I agree with Austin, there is that silver lining that you could have a big demand surge if the virus were brought under control. That's possible. But are stocks going to go back up? I wonder about that, because I think that there's just this corporate debt picture out there, and we're just beginning to see how those dominoes are going to fall. And if stocks don't go back up, I think you're still going to see consumer spending, which is 2/3 of the economy, be pretty low come November.
All right, Ronna Foroohar and Austin Goolsbee, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Breaking right now, we have some brand new CNN polling on how the American public is responding to the coronavirus pandemic and how Americans feel about President Trump's leadership during this crisis. Let's get right to CNN political director David Chalian. And David, let's start with the coronavirus itself. How do Americans feel about the potential personal impact?
Well, we asked, do you think you're going to see people infected in your local community? And look at this, Jake. Add this up. 55%, a majority, say it's very or somewhat likely that they're going to see a local case of coronavirus in their community. Are they prepared for that? If somebody in their family gets sick, we asked them that as well. And we saw nearly 7 in 10, 68%, if you see when we asked on the next question here, if indeed somebody in their family member gets coronavirus, are you prepared? 68%. Very or somewhat prepared if indeed somebody in their family gets coronavirus.
All right, well, that's some good news, at least in terms of a majority of the Americans feeling prepared. How do Americans think that President Trump and the federal government are dealing with this pandemic?
Yeah, this is not a great number for President Trump. You see here his approval rating on handling of coronavirus is 41%. 48% disapprove, and Jake, I'm sure this won't surprise you, but like everything else in Washington and as it relates to President Trump's standing with the American people, this is driven by partisanship. Take a look here. You see that 79% of Republicans approve of the way the president is handling the coronavirus outbreak. 84% of Democrats disapprove. Look at this independence number in the middle. That's always a good guidepost. 37% approval among independents for the president's handling of coronavirus. 47% disapproval. He's minus 10 points here with independents. I also want to just show you, we asked whether or not people are confident that the government can prevent a nationwide epidemic. A majority are somewhat or very confident. Only 18% say very confident. But add in the 39%, you get to 57%, a pretty decent majority, who are very or somewhat confident that the federal government can prevent a nationwide epidemic here.
All right, so confidence in the government, if not in President Trump overall. I'm guessing this is a poll that President Trump won't be tweeting out, but let me ask you, David, the polls on his handling of coronavirus, pretty negative. A plurality says disapprove. Does that affect President Trump's overall approval rating right now?
Take a look. 43% is his overall approval rating, 53% disapprove. This number basically doesn't budge. Look at it over the last 6 months. You can see how consistent President Trump is. 43, 43, 43, 42, 41, 39, all within the margin of error here. This is not yet, and again, this poll was taken through Saturday night, not yet having an impact on the president's overall approval rating, Jake. And of course, let's look at that number now that we're in an election year and look at where he measures up to his modern day predecessors at this point in the election year, March of the election year. Donald Trump is down here. He's right between George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter, not company you want to keep in an election year. You'll note that both of those